Hey everybody, I thought I'd make another little astrology forecast video talking about the movement of the transits and cycles within astrology, kind of flowing through the Libra full moon that is coming up later this week around April 5th or April 6th, depending on your time zone, that then takes us into a intense eclipse season, which is going to involve the first in a series of eclipses in Aries, which, as we'll talk about, is almost practically speaking a Taurus eclipse at the same time, but it is the first eclipse in Aries, followed by a Scorpio lunar eclipse. I haven't made one of these videos recently, have just been very busy, and I don't know if you've had the same experience that I have. I'm not sure if it's just because of all these major ingresses with Saturn entering Pisces and Pluto entering Aquarius and Mars and Gemini finally shifting into Mars in Cancer. But it just seems like time has really been flying and speeding past recently. But I hope everyone is doing well. And there's a lot to talk about in this little section of time we have coming up here. So it starts with this Libra full moon on April 6th if you're on the East Coast, but if you are in Mountain time zone or Pacific time zone like I am, it's going to be late on April 5th. There's a full moon in the middle of Libra, about 16 degrees, so it's that second decan of Libra. And interestingly, the sun is exalted and moving in between Chiron and Jupiter at this time. So right before this full moon, we actually will have a Sun Chiron conjunction. And then we'll have a period of time, which we're going to talk about here coming up, where Jupiter continues to be combust with the sun and then will be reanimated a little bit less than a week later, around April 11th, with a conjunction with the sun, which is a solar conjunction of Jupiter. So there's interestingly something about Jupiter. We're at the very end of an entire Jupiter cycle here. Jupiter already has been invisible in the underworld for a period of time. It crossed over that 15-degree mark back around the spring equinox, a little bit after that. And back in March, we actually had a Jupiter Chiron conjunction in Aries, which has now been separating. But there's something about this full moon that's pulling us back into that Jupiter Chiron cycle starting. I think one thing that Jupiter Chiron conjunction made me curious about is systems of oppression from a social justice perspective, which does also connect to this Libra full moon, especially any cultural identities that are marginalized or feeling persecuted. There has been a number of stories in the news around that, especially involving some trans populations. So that could be something related to this. What I actually had been hoping for is around a bunch of different issues like that the Jupiter Chiron conjunction in Aries would actually be very catalyzing in a way of organizing and getting people connected to more networks of support and allyship. And in response to some of the different judicial and legislative actions that are going on around in the United States, for example. But in Jupiter Chiron also, Chiron being such a primordial ancient figure, there's also certainly connected to nature There's obviously also associations we can think of with different environmental protections or lack of protections. There's been a lot of news about, issues around water, safe drinking water, which is certainly something we'd also be expecting, though, with Saturn having entered Pisces, and that definitely has been happening. As well as something about, Jupiter, Chiron, and Aries definitely could also relate to various different indigenous populations, different parts of the world. So whatever it is exactly that's being brought up here, I think on a more personal level, Jupiter, Chiron, and Aries, something dying, something being reborn about this, being regenerated about this, and it's being illuminated here. This could also just be different parts of yourself that have been cast off or have been repressed that are kind of ready to be reclaimed in this fiery Aries way. But at the same time, since Jupiter is not yet at its superior conjunction and not yet being reanimated, there could be some issues around, just some pain or things being revealed that needs to be rebalanced, recalibrated in a Libra type of way. Especially how does this play into, what we want to produce or create or do with our life versus our within the context of our relationships. I think on a much bigger scale, though, what this Libra full moon is most about is helping us recalibrate to these huge societal collective changes that are going on, that are signified by Pluto having recently entered Aquarius, Saturn having recently entered Pisces. And on a smaller scale, Mars having gone into Cancer. We just had the Mars in Cancer trining Saturn. As we come into this full moon, Mercury will have gone into Taurus. It would have already formed a square with Pluto a few days before this full moon. And as this full moon hits, Mercury is moving through a sextile with Saturn in Pisces and moving into a sextile with Mars in Cancer. So Mercury in Taurus, as it's forming this conjunction with the North Node, is sort of threading the needle of connecting all these major ingresses. And as we'll see in this month ahead, Mercury is playing a really pivotal role, as Mercury will be ultimately going retrograde. The full moon in Libra, I think, just in terms of how much has been changing, speeding up, accelerating, what you want might be, you might already be feeling a change in what you want, what people in your relationship want, the role you want to play within the world, and how you're sensing on a collective level that might be changing, and how you personally fit into this. The Libra being a sign of great intellect, Libra is able to weigh and measure and think through and deeply contemplate situations and dynamics, systems of power, system, and our part within that, really more than any other sign. And so I think there's just something about this full moon that's really illuminating things, helping us realize what needs balanced, what needs changed, what needs adjusted, that sort of thing. It's ruled by Venus and Taurus. So Venus is in her own domicile. She's moving through a sextile aspect with Neptune in Pisces, which also could speak to something, something creative that you undertake during this full moon, or perhaps going to a place of imagination, fantasy, music, dance, anything to get you into your body and your imagination and kind of open up your creative flow, as a way of kind of also, I feel like, adjusting to and rebalancing and dealing with all the big changes that we're going through in the world right now. That aspect between Venus and Taurus with Neptune is important because a few days later, Venus is going to leave her sign of Taurus and enter Gemini. which as far as the waning moon goes, moving from that Libra full moon to the Aries solar eclipse, that's one of the biggest ingresses and aspects that are going to happen, because as soon as Venus goes into Gemini on April 10th, she's going to form a very flowing trine to Pluto and Aquarius on April 11th, and then move into a square aspect with Saturn in Pisces on April 14th. So just like how Mercury in Taurus is moving through these aspects with Pluto and Saturn and then Mars at the Libra full moon, after the Libra full moon, Venus comes into Gemini and then reactivates Pluto Saturn. So this week surrounding the Libra full moon, we are really getting a big dosage of coming to terms more with the meaning of these recent ingresses of Pluto and Saturn and how to adjust to them. So it's really good to pay attention to what's coming up for you along these lines. What happens right after that is on April 11th, the Jupiter superior conjunction in Aries. This is when Jupiter is reanimated, reborn. I'm going to talk about that here in just a moment. And as that happens, we are entering that window where we're getting like a week before the solar eclipse. Oftentimes that week before an eclipse, we can already start feeling something building with intensity. Storylines often start accelerating. Eclipses do tend to bring major new developments in our story, new relationships sometimes, some kind of new surge of activity. This is especially the case because this is a north node solar eclipse. So the sun and moon are going to be aligned with the north node. Because it's happening at the very end of Aries, it's going to form a square aspect with Pluto and Aquarius. So again, we're just reemphasizing the fact that Pluto and Aquarius is just getting this really major activation, and it'll become a lot more clear what that initial meaning of the Pluto ingress into Aquarius means for you. Now with Jupiter, like I said, it's going to form a conjunction with the sun on April 11th. There is a difference between the idealized Hellenistic astrology version of helically rising and setting versus the actual reality of when you can first see Jupiter in the sky. And so you usually can see Jupiter still once Jupiter gets within 15 degrees of the sun. But that 15-degree window does really work well, not only paying attention with natal astrology, but also just in world events. I often notice that planets moving, crossing that 15-degree zone tend to actually line up with important events happening. So when Jupiter first got within 15 degrees of the sun, that was around March 22nd, really lined up pretty closely with that Aries new moon that then formed a conjunction with Jupiter. So that Aries new moon, there's something really important there regarding Jupiter, some message being transmitted. You can think about the entire cycle of Jupiter that's been in effect this past year. Jupiter formed its last superior conjunction with the sun. It was around March 5th of 2022, and that was in Pisces. And then sort of around the Aries equinox last year, it was around the time that Jupiter was helically rising and becoming visible, or at least by the end of March it was. So from that recent equinox up until this Libra full moon, and then going into April 11th, Jupiter is in this inner space that you see on the synodic cycle, where we have a bear that my friend Mish illustrated for me. This bear hibernating in this liminal cave environment. This is a bit of Jupiter leading us through its own his own mystery initiation. Something is dying here, something is being reborn, there's something mysterious changing. We may not be completely clear what it is, but for all of us, it can have something to do with the meaning we find in life, our purpose, other themes of Jupiter, such as our aspirations, important alliances. And, there's also been great uncertainty that's really come up all over. It's very, very palpable in the news and current events as we've been going through this experience of adjusting to Pluto being in Aquarius, Saturn being in Pisces. Jupiter going through this liminal death rebirth process certainly is adding on to it. But as Jupiter comes into this union with the Sun on April 11th, really pay attention to what seems to be reanimated in your own life in correspondence. What do you notice is something that is being emptied or shed right now? What are you shedding? What are you letting go of? What needs to die? Really paying attention to that. Also thinking back upon this whole last year of the Jupiter cycle, what all has come into your life since last March and April of 2022. Being grateful for what's come into your life during the time of Jupiter in Pisces and Jupiter in Aries. We're now reseeding a new cycle for Jupiter that's going to take us from Jupiter being in Aries through Jupiter being in Taurus and forming a conjunction with Uranus in the next year. So we know this Jupiter cycle ahead, it's going to be eventful, it's going to be exciting, it's going to be innovative, revolutionary, probably really volatile. It's going to have this Uranian quality. And interestingly, as we're going to look at here, there's a Uranian quality about this time that Jupiter is moving in this liminal regeneration of space as part of its reanimation and rebirth. So at that April 11th conjunction, it's more about Jupiter being reborn, being regenerated, and something is going to be incubating as Jupiter starts to get away from the sun. First, it will be under combustion, about 8 degrees from the sun, and still kind of burning up and purifying, and maybe a lot more sort of inner visions coming up that aren't yet totally fully formed. And then as Mercury moves from being 8 degrees away from the sun towards 15 degrees, something should be re-emerging, reborn, hopefully a new, stronger sense of purpose and vision for the year ahead. And when Jupiter hits that exact heliacal rising of 15 degrees, it's going to be around May 2nd here in the Northern Hemisphere, which is really beautiful because that is the time of Beltane and spring really coming in with a greater full force. It's really beautiful to have Jupiter align with that. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, rather than spring, it's more of the autumn, but my understanding is it's actually very beautiful there, typically at that time of the year as well. And so there's a nice lineup there, just with especially in Northern Hemisphere, that sense of spring coming through and life bursting out of the soil, bursting from this darkness into life and color, and Jupiter doing the same. Following, this is going back actually this is just showing a chart for March 22nd around the equinox when Jupiter was heliacally setting. You can see here, around 14 degrees or so, 15 degrees away from the sun, much closer to Chiron at that point. This will be the Jupiter superior conjunction set for Washington, D.C. It's going to be at 21 degrees and 45 minutes. So one thing is if you have important placement in Aries around 22 degrees, 20 degrees, or in any cardinal sign, or any of the fire signs, or 20, 22 of Gemini or Aquarius, or Libra, these are going to be, it's going to be especially activating. And then this is a chart showing around the time that Jupiter is heliacally rising on May 2nd. It's going to be around 26 Aries, so towards the end of Aries. So when Jupiter leaves Aries for Taurus, which will be a couple of weeks after this, Jupiter is going to be picking up speed and really, bursting into Taurus with this new force of, life, like kind of thrusting, which is, again, really beautiful for thinking of how fertile Taurus can be. Now, one thing you can notice here when Jupiter is heliacally rising May 2nd, you can see Mercury is really close to the sun. and around 11 degrees. And if you're looking at that previous chart, when Jupiter has a superior conjunction, you can see that Mercury is direct at about 11 degrees. Now, this is important because what's going on here was around April 11th, when Jupiter's having his superior conjunction and being reanimated, Mercury is reaching his maximum elongation as a evening star. This is when Mercury, they get up to being their greatest height. And at the same time, they start slowing down. They start matching the speed of the sun and start slowing down to move slower than the sun. And each night we'll see Mercury getting lower and lower at the horizon until Mercury stations retrograde and then disappears into darkness. So around this Jupiter superior conjunction, at the same time, something's being reanimated to kind of integrate and incubate about Jupiter. We're starting to move into not only an eclipse season, but a Mercury retrograde season. And so a lot of times this period it's a good time to already start thinking about the upcoming Mercury retrograde, being in Taurus. What are you going to need to kind of let go of, make room for in your life? We'll talk more about this here in a second, but it's interesting because at the same time, we're maybe already sensing this. There's something about Jupiter that we're letting go of, and something's being reborn at the same time. We then move into that Aries solar eclipse, which we'll talk more about here in a second. That Aries solar eclipse on April 19th is followed by the sun immediately entering Taurus and forming a square aspect with Pluto. And then the next day, Mercury stationing retrograde. It's a very powerful retrograde station that we're going to look at. It's very close to Uranus. Mercury will then sextile Mars in Cancer on April 23rd, and then come back to form the conjunction with the sun on May 1st. And fascinatingly, the same day Mercury forms that conjunction with the sun, Pluto will be stationing retrograde. And as we also just looked at, Jupiter will be heliacally rising. So we're going to have three, thrice great intensifications of Mercury being reanimated, Pluto stationing, and Jupiter being reborn, coming alive again for all of us at the same time, basically. That's the very beginning of May. And then a few days later, we will have Venus in Gemini activating both Jupiter and Neptune at the same time by forming a harmonious sextile with Jupiter in Aries and a square aspect with Neptune in Pisces. That's on May 4th, which takes us directly into this lunar eclipse in Scorpio opposite Uranus. So if you can't tell, this is a very volatile, pretty wild time period. Very activating, though. So it's one of those things where I think it's a time period to just really focus on. The more you can kind of be clear about what do you want to create in this time period. What do you really want to bring into your life in April and May? And just think about going all the way through the rest of May into June, and getting intensely focused on that, but at the same time, not so obsessively, tightly, like you're trying to control everything that's going to happen, because you're going to have to leave room and space for the unexpected. This is going to be a very volatile time. At the same time, that can be very exciting and very creative when you kind of jump into it and engage with it. And I would actually recommend that, just to keep in mind that everything's not going to necessarily go to plan, and you're going to have to be flexible, which is a lesson Mercury is here to teach us, even when in Taurus. So that hybrid solar eclipse in DC, it's going to be on April 20th. You can see it's at 29 degrees and 50 minutes of Aries. So it's practically so close to being a Taurus eclipse. And that is why, as soon as the exact moment of sun, moon come together and the moon's moving through that eclipse, it's going to basically, she'll enter Taurus and square Pluto. So it's actually an eclipse squaring that 0 degree of Aquarius Pluto. And so this is going to be a very loud activation of Pluto in Aquarius and what kind of themes we can expect. It's also going to be the first of the Aries eclipses. So especially if you are somebody that uses whole sign, you do want to make sure you think about that whole sign Aries house in your chart. There is a new theme here coming in and being activated. And again, because it's with the North Node, we can think about there is some sort of surge, new streaming developments coming in. The last aspect of the moon is going to be that conjunction with Jupiter. So, and it is, of course, as we mentioned, Jupiter has been recently reanimated, yet is still in combustion here, pretty close to the sun. So, there is interestingly something about that new, incubating vision of Jupiter that is kind of feeding into this eclipse. And then, it's catalyzing and having to face off with what is the meaning of this. How do we take that vision and how is that interfacing with Pluto and Aquarius? And then, of course, not too long after the moon goes into Taurus, she'll form a sextile with Saturn in Pisces. She'll then move through a sextile with Mars in Cancer into a conjunction with Mercury and Uranus. So the moon in the day after this is really threading through and making lots of major connections to all the major players, basically, with the exception of Venus. So again, we don't know what will happen at this. We can certainly think really big collective events. And again, knowing this is the first of the Aries eclipses, and we're going to have some pretty powerful Aries eclipses occurring in this sequence in the years ahead. Just being curious about what is this new, Aries development that's starting to happen for you. Now, I mentioned how the moon will be moving through a conjunction with Mercury after this. So the day after the eclipse on April 21st, when Mercury is stationing retrograde, you can see here, this is calculated for the exact moment that Mercury stations retrograde in Washington, D.C. You can see the moon is applying and forming an exact conjunction with Mercury as Mercury is stationing and then moving through into a conjunction with Uranus. And so although Mercury is not stationing in an exact conjunction with Uranus, first of all, Mercury is really close, 2 degrees, within 3 degrees from Uranus. So there is a Mercury-Uranian activation here. Then on top of that, the moon's translating that light between them. And so we clearly have this major Mercury-Uranian quality to the beginning of this retrograde, and it's going to be a theme running through the retrograde. And so this is also then going to be doubly important because the lunar eclipse we'll talk about coming up is opposite Uranus. So there's definitely a major Uranian quality to this time period that we're entering, which can be exciting. It can be innovative. Again, also, of course, volatile, unexpected things happening. So that's why I would just really recommend taking action where you can, doing innovative things, trying to break into some new exciting pursuits and directions, but keeping in mind that, you're going to have to shift and make some adjustments. So this is an image that Mish created for me of the Mercury synodic cycle. As I mentioned previously, it'll be around April 11th, that same time that Jupiter is reanimated, that Mercury will reach their maximum elongation. Then they'll be slowing down until they get to that April 21st stationing retrograde, which they won't be moving. They will then be descending into the darkness of the retrograde, that cocoon down at the bottom. Mercury getting as close to us as Mercury gets within its orbit. And it's a time period then that can really be used for purging things, releasing things, changing old habits, because we're talking about Mercury in an earth sign. You can think about information in your body and senses. What are some real practical, tangible structures, rules you adhere to that maybe it's time to let go of? What are some bodily habits, whether that's diet or health or exercise, things you've been kind of stuck in a rut? What do you want to change? It's a great time to actively change things. That would normally be the case with Mercury in an earth sign going retrograde. The earth signs are the most resistant to change, but it's a great time to get change happening. But because it's Mercury with Uranus, it makes it even more potential to really kind of break out of some old habits. And you can be intentional with that, try to really focus it in on some things that you do purposefully want to change. That can also be a really great time for some real practical skill building. If there's some kind of project or focus you need to work on developing, creating space and time for real intensified focus on that, with Mercury being so close to us, intensified. As well as, again, even that Uranian quality can be kind of chaotic. It can be exciting. Mercury, Uranus together can really make things happen, accelerate developments of things that you've been wanting to have happen. So there, it is possible to work with. So what's going to happen then is Mercury will get closer and closer and closer to the sun. That feeling of purging, purgation, purification, burning things off, emptying, shedding things will get more intensified. And Mercury will then come into their conjunction with the sun on May 1st, which is the same time that Pluto is stationing retrograde. And it is a few days before the lunar eclipse in Taurus. So this just looks very hectic. However, because Mercury is being clarified and reborn and reanimated, this is one of those opportunities where Mercury, is probably being kind of tricky, but, really pay attention, listen to the messages you get at this time. It's Mercury, will be trying. I always see Mercury as trying to help, even if you get frustrated with Hermes. He's usually showing you things you need to pay attention to. And that's definitely going to be the case here. Now, then when this eclipse hits around the 4th and 5th, that will be the same time that Mercury crosses the ecliptic. So Mercury always does this loop shape when Mercury goes retrograde. And during that loop shape, which is part of the reason why Mercury retrogrades is all about, leaving the normal, changing habits, going in a new direction, maybe a more of a countercultural conditioned direction. When Mercury crosses the ecliptic, moving across its own node, that's often an important intensified time. It can be kind of volatile because this is lining up right with the eclipse. This actually happened at the last eclipse in Taurus, and there were a bunch of real volatile things happening with tech companies. I think we could definitely expect that going on this time around as well. But again, just in your own life, this just ups the ante that we can expect lots of changes and developments happening at this time. Now, while that period there around May 4th, 5th, after the inferior conjunction, and we're getting this eclipse and Mercury's crossing the ecliptic, obviously probably pretty volatile. About a week later, right as Mercury is slowing down to station direct, Mercury makes some very positive aspects. Mercury forms a sextile with Venus in Cancer. Of course, Mercury is in Taurus, so Venus is receiving Mercury through that sextile. And Mercury also forms a sextile with Saturn in Pisces, which means Venus in Cancer is forming a trine with Saturn in Pisces, the exaltation of Venus, at the same time. So this is more of a harmonious container awaiting us at the end of this retrograde that I think could be really fruitful and helpful as far as if we're letting go of old structures and routines and things like that and habits during the first part of the Mercury retrograde. At the ending part, it can help us really implement and set into place these new structures and routines and things like that, that we really want to be more like solid supports for ourselves going forward, that are more aligned with the sort of authentic creativity we want to put out there. Mercury will then station direct on May 14th, and then 2 days later on May 16th, Jupiter enters Taurus. So what this means is essentially the entire Mercury retrograde is basically tilling the soil, getting the soil and land ready, thinking about that Taurus area of your chart. And what's it look like now? What do you really want it to ideally be like once Jupiter comes into Taurus? So Mercury, that whole retrograde leading up to the middle of May can really be thought of as a preparation for the entrance of Jupiter into Taurus. And if we can make some really nice adjustments and get ourselves with whatever Taurus means to you in your chart in a better place, the better we will be able to take advantage of the opportunities Jupiter will be bringing to us in Taurus. And then just to kind of finish off the cycle, you know, Mercury will be moving direct at this point, but very slow when Jupiter comes into Taurus. Once we get to the end of May, May 29th, Mercury will be reaching maximum elongation as a morning star and starting to speed up and move fast. I'm going to be speaking at NORWAC around that time. I don't know if any of y'all are going to be at NORWAC. If so, I look forward to seeing you there. I love that about NORWAC this year, that Mercury will be in that particular phase. When that end of May period, that's when Mercury starts accelerating in speed. That is a great time to really even more fully, you know, implement whatever changes you were putting into place. And what's pretty amazing about that is as Mercury speeds up there, May 31st, Mercury moves beyond the retrograde shadow zone where Mercury originally stationed retrograde. And then early June, around June 4th, Mercury finally completes that conjunction with Uranus and Taurus. And this will take place around 20 degrees of Taurus. So there's something interestingly with Mercury and Uranus that gets going and activated towards the end of April, but doesn't fully come into effect until we get to the beginning of June. So it'll be interesting to see what that means for all of you. This is Mercury stationing retrograde. I already talked about that. This is Pluto stationing retrograde on the same day. So you can see that when Pluto stations retrograde, Mercury will be entering the heart of the sun to be reanimated. Pluto stationing here at 0 degrees, 21 minutes of Aquarius is pretty amazing. It's so close to the degree. It is at the exact degree and even close to the minute where the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction happened at the end of 2020. You might remember that there was also then a Mars-Saturn conjunction that happened after that. And last year, there was actually a Venus-Mars conjunction that also took place at 0 Aquarius. So we've had Jupiter-Saturn, Mars-Saturn, Venus-Mars all activating new cycles at that degree. But of course, a Jupiter-Saturn cycle starting there is particularly important for the next 20 years. And so this intensification of Jupiter here will be, again, really important to pay attention to. And as I also mentioned, at the same time, remember, not only is Mercury being reanimated here, so Mercury is intensified, but so is Jupiter, because Jupiter is likely rising, becoming visible again. At the same time, Jupiter is starting to end its time in Aries and head towards that North Node in Taurus. So I hope, rather than totally stressful and hectic, this is actually busy but exciting for you. And you know, I know there's been a lot of fear people have with what's happening in the world, but with Saturn in Pisces and Pluto in Aquarius, we also need to think about, instead of just being fearful about what can happen, just getting excited about new potentials, new things being opened up to do and pursue that weren't in place before, because of how much it's going to be shifting around with different systems and the changes that's going to be happening. This is then showing that exact inferior conjunction of Mercury on May 1st, which is going to be at 11 degrees and 19 minutes of Taurus. So one thing definitely to do would be to think about where this is in your chart. Again, this is Mercury getting reseated. There's sometimes, there might be some Mercury retrograde issues that get clarified here. On a deeper level, though, I really like always thinking about this as seeding new exciting ideas for the cycle ahead. And so it's always really important just to pay attention to your dreams, notice the different signs of, what's emerging as these new ideas that you can develop going ahead. And this then takes us directly into this lunar eclipse in Scorpio, which is pretty closely opposite Uranus. It is ruled by Mars in Cancer. It is, not a total lunar eclipse. There's definitely some separation between the moon and the south node, but being a lunar eclipse opposite Uranus, we can definitely expect, again, another indication of volatility and change. And there's probably something with this May 5th lunar eclipse in Scorpio that harkens back to the total eclipse in Taurus that was November 8th of last year. They're at fairly similar degrees. That lunar eclipse is actually exactly forming a conjunction with Uranus. Now, this one had, in my mind, actually more intense aspects than the one that's coming up, because we had Saturn in Aquarius squaring it, as well as squaring Venus, and Mercury was in the middle of that eclipse. But interestingly, Mercury was coming into a superior conjunction at that time during that lunar eclipse. And again, this one coming up, Mercury's in an inferior conjunction leading into it. So both cases, there's something mercurial happening. Mercury's kind of mediating them. If you think back to what was changing in your life November 8th of last year, there might be a thread of development to this one. Being a south node lunar eclipse, there is, again, the sun's over there with the north node. There's a lot over there with the north node, right? Mercury is retrograde coming back towards it. Jupiter's heading towards it. There's definitely a sense of growth and surging of development that's kind of flowing out of that previous solar eclipse. But because the moon is being eclipsed in the sign of the south node, at the same time, there is something of the past identity, memories, patterns being eclipsed, needing to be let go, released, sacrificed, purged. As Mercury is still combust and retrograde, Mercury will be supporting that as far as what still needs to be let go or changed. And so that would definitely be something to be paying attention to there with that eclipse. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for your support on Patreon. It really means a great deal to me and helps me get going with my work. And in terms of me and my work and this upcoming Jupiter cycle that's coming to an end now and beginning, I'm hoping there's going to be a lot of new, planning a lot more exciting developments through my Patreon. So I look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you again for being here.